to 100,000 years old. But TL and ESR have also dated a group of Middle Eastern Neanderthals. This Neanderthal, found here in Kibara Cave, is now dated to around 60,000 years. This means that Neanderthals were living in Israel far more recently than the Kafse and Skul moderns, and therefore cannot be their evolutionary ancestors. The relationship between the Israeli modern and Neanderthal populations has become crucial in assessing which of the two models is correct. The multi-regionalists had previously argued that modern humans, like the Kafse boy, were descended from the Neanderthals. In the light of the new dates, they've been forced to reassess their position. They are now arguing that Neanderthals and modern human beings are one and the same species. Scientists define a species by the ability to produce viable or successful offspring. The new dates meant that it was quite possible that modern and Neanderthal populations may have encountered one another. Speculation is sharpened by the fact that the modern people from this cave, Skul, were only 100 yards or so from the Neanderthal cave of Tabun and are dated to around the same time. The issue is whether the Neanderthals have any role in the final stages of modern human evolution.
We have a number of Neanderthal specimens, partial skeletons, crania, very large samples of teeth and so on. And so they're important as a source of data, but my work on the Neanderthals suggests that they are not very like modern humans in a number of respects. And the differences they show, some of them are differences merely because they're earlier in time. But in other respects, their differences are, in my view, specializations, ones where they have diverged away from the evolutionary line that was leading to modern people. And it's those features which I believe they developed over 200,000 years at least, perhaps longer, which indicate that there was an evolutionary split, perhaps 300,000 years ago, and that evolutionary split led to Neanderthals in the north, in Europe and Western Asia, and it led to the evolution of modern humans in the south, in Africa.
But Professor Wolpoff disagrees. He believes that people living today are the descendants of Neanderthals.
We have met Neanderthal, and he is us. Of course, literally Neanderthals are no longer here. All Cro-Magnons are no longer here. The Skul Kafse folk are no longer here. They've all suffered the same fate, the fate of any grandparents. They've expired. They've left their descendants behind.
For Professor Wolpoff, the Israeli evidence suggests a situation much like that reflected in Jerusalem today. Israel is a crossroads between three continents. Peoples of different racial groups converge here. Professor Wolpoff believes that the differences between the modern and Neanderthal skeletons are no more than superficial racial variations. He argues that modern human beings and Neanderthals, like the peoples in Israel today, are joint members of just one species, Homo sapiens. Here at the Neanderthal cave of Amud, beside the Sea of Galilee, the question of species is brought sharply into focus. The Neanderthal which was found buried here is bigger than any other by several inches. Its size and certain of its cranial features have raised the question of whether they might in fact be marks of interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern human beings. Dr. Yoel Rak is an anatomist from Tel Aviv University. He holds very similar views to Dr. Chris Stringer and the Out of Africa School, and is firmly of the belief that Neanderthals belong to a different species. He and a group of colleagues are re-excavating Amud in the hope of finding more adult Neanderthals, which he believes will show that modern and Neanderthal populations cannot have been interbreeding.
I have a cast of the Amud man, so to speak. It was a male, and that's why it's called the Amud man. It's a fascinating specimen. First of all, it has the largest brain capacity in all of them in the human record, and it has all kind of peculiarities. Some of them are not really within the Neanderthals' anatomy, but as I said, I tend to view them as variation due to the geographical distribution of the Neanderthals.
For Dr. Rack, the unusual shape of the Amud Neanderthal is explained by the distance it lived from the classic European Neanderthals. This, he believes, would have resulted in the evolution of its own distinctive racial characteristics, and had nothing to do with interbreeding with modern human beings.
The question to ask is, how come you find two hominids in two caves in Israel that are geographically only 25 kilometers apart, and they are so different, much more than what we find between, let's say, the Kalahari Bushmen and the Eskimos in Alaska. These are differences of huge magnitude, what we find between Neanderthals and modern humans. In my view, it's a different species, and there is no doubt, at least to my mind, that they are a different branch with very little to do with our own history.
Professor Wolpoff takes a different view.
The Eve theorists have been telling us that Neanderthals must be a separate species from modern people and therefore couldn't interbreed with them. But Amud shows that this is absolutely not the case. If we look at a Neanderthal from Western Europe, for instance, this male from Le Ferracé, which has a number of typical and distinct Neanderthal features, including a very high nasal angle seen here, and a characteristic flattening at the back of the skull seen here, and a shape something like a drop when the skull is held in this position, where the widest is here, the narrowest is here. These characteristics of Neanderthals are largely lacking in some people in the Levant that are regarded as modern humans. For instance, School 5. School 5 has a low nasal angle, doesn't have this characteristic flattening at the very back of the skull, and doesn't have the same shape to the top of its skull. What's interesting is that Amud fits exactly between them in terms of its morphology. The Amud morphology lacks the high nasal angle, but it's higher than it is in School, and it lacks the flattening in the back. The shape of the skull is somewhat more like the Europeans, but not enough like them to be called the same. And to have a situation like this, where three specimens form a continuum of morphology, not two distinct groups, would suggest that they represent the result of gene flow and population movement, and therefore these two cannot be different species.
The argument between the paleontologists remains unresolved. They each have different views of who the Kafsi boy is and what he represents. But the search for human origin does not end here. Major advances have recently been made by a new group, the geneticists. Their studies are shifting the balance of evidence and giving the Kafsi boy and his fellow Israeli moderns a pivotal role in the birth of all people alive today.